I was hoping to avoid this situation of being up here all by myself. Hey, thanks.
I'll join.
No, it was more. So what we're going to do in the last, this last half hour or so, is going to have an opportunity for people to bring up either things that they wanted to say and didn't get a chance to say, or to step back and think collectively about the 2 days as a whole and maybe reflect on kind of where we've come or thoughts that have come up along the way. I also wanted to mention, so the participants will know that at the beginning of this, we were hoping that this might turn into a collected volume at a certain point, and we are hoping to do that. The Jordan Center is going to support that. I've spoken to several publishers, and there's a great deal of wide-eyed interest in the topic, and a few publishers who are sort of insisting that they get a crack at publishing this exciting volume. So there's a lot of excitement in doing that, so we'll talk about that in the future. What we wanted to do here is to just open it up for last comments and reflections. Yeah, Adrian.
Yeah, well, I wanted to thank the organizer and also all of you, because really this has been a fantastic experience. I've learned so much. I've gotten so many ideas that I will use. I'm going to be writing to many of you and asking if I can cite you in my book, in your papers, and so forth. So this has been wonderful. I had one observation, and this is in no way a reflection on any of the papers that were here at this conference. It's just my sense sort of the field as a whole, and that is that that the study of race is much better developed for the imperial period than for the Soviet period. That's sort of my impression. I don't know if the rest of you have this impression too. And I wondered if anyone had any thoughts about why that's the case, what we can do, should we do anything to, address this? Can we do anything to address this? I just wondered. I've learned so much from all the, from all the papers here, but I felt that there's a richness in the imperial material, sort of it's more developed. It seems that there's been more work done in this field, and I don't know if it's because some people in the Soviet field have just decided race isn't important, or whether it's because we have too much accepted the Soviet categories and the Soviet arguments that there's no race. I'm not sure exactly. I feel that I also am very late coming to this issue, so I'm wondering why and what the rest of you think.
Shall I respond? I thought I just had a conversation with Eric about why there was one kind of reaction to his article in 2002, but others kind of dismissed the idea that race had any relevance to understanding Soviet nationalities policies, and now it's a very different response. And of course, there is a paradigm change. But I think that there are we're locked into particular debates, and there was the impact of a particular debate of the time on the reception of Eric's article, and maybe kind of more broadly on why race hasn't sort of featured that much in the discussion of Soviet nationalist policy. And that's the kind of debate about what happens or how productive is a comparison between the Soviet and the Nazi system. And many specialists of the Soviet Union actually emphasizing the difference with the Nazi system. And because of the centrality of race in the Nazi system, it's kind of its importance in the Soviet context was kind of in a way, or downplayed.
Precisely because of the way it was posed in other words.
So you think that if say, a Latin Americanist had written a similar article to Slavic Review, the reaction would have been different?
Maybe, but I think there's still the Francine in her work very much sort of engages with this kind of comparison in the 1930s between Soviet policies and what's emerging in Germany. So she was already, and in some ways earlier as well, they were already themselves locked into that kind of juxtaposition and a very narrow view of race as it was defined in the context of Nazi Germany. But I was struck in our sort of this workshop that we didn't discuss post-communist Russia, where actually racism, not just use of race, but racism in quite pure form and disputable forms come to the fore, and it's probably a kind of separate, a topic for a separate workshop, but in a way sort of curious that we crossed the 1917 divide, but haven't crossed very much, a little bit, but not much, 1991 divide.
Actually, on the topic, does anyone know or have any opinion about Nikolai Zaharov's book, Attaining Whiteness, published by the Uppsala University, which is precisely on,
Yeah,
I don't know.
I think it's an interesting book. Yeah, I think it's, I know it, yeah. I think it's good. That's one of the first works on the topic. In English, there are no Russian
that's right,
scholars.
yeah.
It seems to me that some of the implications of Elena's paper speak to the contemporary situation, right? Because you're, in a way, trying to explain some of the structural differences by juxtaposing it to the American case. Some of what the kind of, not the inevitability, but some of the kind of preconditions that allowed for simply not seeing certain kinds of categorization of human difference. And I mean, from what I understand, there's still a very strong resistance to acknowledging that what's happening in Russia, the violence and discrimination and so on, is really racism. That there are sort of, you know, I read something that the ambassador, the Russian ambassador to the EU in Brussels was asked point blank right after the Moscow riots, you know, why is all this racism happening? And his answer was, we don't have racism. Which was like, у нас нет секса. It was sort of just like, and that's I think what he meant. You know, it wasn't, no, we don't have violence and we didn't, you know, someone didn't really get killed. It was that, well, you misunderstand why this happened and what they were thinking. And I think that, I mean, that was one of the things that I thought of in your piece.
But on the other hand, I think that while in contemporary Russia you have this racial discourse much more explicitly present. So in the new school books, for example, Russian history for sixth grade, you have Russians introduced as Aryans. You have this very developed anti-gay and anti-lesbian discourse connected to the theme of purity of the national body, and this is discussed in press. And so it's again about, I think it's about teaching people to recognize these discourses as racial discourses, and here there is this problem with not just public discourses, because you do have public intellectuals saying that, guys, this is about, race. You are racist. This is not only about this particular
Sometimes
group.
they call it fascism.
Yes, fascism or race, but you don't have academic discourse. You don't have, say, historical or sociological or anthropological community taking stance on this, discussing this issue with Russians as Aryans in, textbooks. Again, you have this nationalizing language, reinforcing this, the language of race, and I think there is a problem with acknowledging this on the academic level. If I may add, when my book on the history of physical anthropology came out in Russia, one of my reviewers accused me in smuggling into Russia the American guild for slavery. And I'm so glad that probably I'm not alone now. There are other potential smugglers. Yes, but this is how the topic is received. So,
There are the young scholars there. There was a recent conference discussed racism, basically, in the Russian educational system and in the press. They these colonies are organized in elite kind of universities,
Yes.
such as European University in St. Petersburg, and that's a small group of people, like-minded people, talking to each other rather than talking to society at large. But also these officials, this Russian representatives in Brussels, they come up with extremely narrow definition of racism, which is, but even then, you can't deny it, it's between white and black people. And that's the narrow definition. So even if you define it that way, you can't deny the existence of racism in today's Russia. But any sort of broader definition of racism, either they don't know, they completely dismiss it.
Yeah, well, not.
Well, I'm sorry, I should mention also Tajik textbooks, where Tajiks are also depicted as alien nation. And true religion is not Islam, but Zoroastrianism. So in fact, this is difficult to talk about racism because it's a typical Soviet primordialism. You know, when people, it's ethnogenesis, it's very nowadays trend in Soviet ethnography. When people were depicted, when the Soviet countries were searching for these ancient roots of each and every nationality, because they were obsessed with this Soviet nation building project, right? And each and every nationality was considered as, you know, having rights to be a nationality and emergent nationality if it has those ancient pre-modern roots. And that's how, you know, Tajiks, Gafurov wrote his very thick book, Tajiki, where he also traced the origin of Tajiks to, it was during the Soviet time, and that book was, you know, considered as very academic, very important research, and he traced the origin of Tajiks to pre-Iranian times, and he was arguing that the Tajiks were even more ancient than Iranians themselves, and that the Tajik language is not a dialect of Iranian Persian language, but it's a very ancient, you know, the ancient roots of the Tajik, of the Iranian, of the Persian language. So that's precisely, you know, a very classical example of primordialism, of the Soviet type of primordialism. And that is now being revived in this post-Soviet Central Asia or elsewhere, you know, where the Kazakhs, the same way also, you know, inventing and reinventing the ancient Kazakh roots that the Kazakhs were mentioned, for example, in Shahnameh, in Ferdowsi, in the 10th century, because there was one word Kazakh, and Kazakh was a village where was mentioned in Shahnameh. So it's absolutely the Soviet type of nation building. Now what we're witnessing in the post-Soviet space. And here, once again, the question of race. How much does it have to do with race? I mean, with established idea of race. It's completely fabricated, but it's a very interesting post-Soviet, but very much, you know, the Soviet, if you like, you know, invention of these Soviet, ancient Soviet nations. So it's just parallel.
Annika?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the kind of whether there is an acknowledgement of racism in current Russian society, where I actually see more and more scholars working on that. I mean, just 2013, NLO published this whole big volume, an edited volume on racism, xenophobia, and discrimination. Alexandra Osipov has been writing about it. And Salva, the Center for Analysis of, I can't remember the name right now, in Moscow, has been documenting racism, ethnic discrimination, and violence since the early 1990s. So I think there are people who talk about it and who name it as what it is. But at the same time, it doesn't surprise me that a government official wouldn't recognize that as racism. I mean, no German government official does that. Where the scholarly community is very, very clear that there is racial discrimination happening in German society. What the Russian government, and what I think is interesting, what they have been doing since the early 90s, is to talk about extremism. There is a law against extremism that has been used to punish racial or racialized violence. But again, as Salva has discussed very, very, very succinctly, I think, is to say that it actually has been used against other people much more often than against racists. That's, I think, one of the major problems. But I think there is some acknowledgement in Russian governmental service that there is a problem. It's not named as what it is.
Yeah, I want to come back to the question of why there seems to be so much less scholarship on the Soviet period, but also linking it to the 1991 divide. And actually, I'm coming back to Annika's opening of her paper, where she says, well, you have now these clear forms of racism against the very same people who 40, 50 years ago were invited to come and be the honest guest of the Soviet Union. And why is that? And clearly, I think nobody here thinks that this is sort of all now as a post-Soviet phenomenon which has been exported or imported from the West. And obviously, there's racism now, there must have been racial discourses of some sort of kind in the Soviet period as well. And maybe we are looking at the wrong point. Maybe we're looking at public discourses, or we're looking at discourses of verbal nature, but maybe actually the way how these racial discourses were transmitted and developed in the Soviet space were more by practice, by attributes. I mean, maybe we have to look at different signifiers in order to come to this racial discourse.
Excuse me, I just want to pick up on Vera's first comments, and also say that I'm very appreciative and indeed flattered by all the comments, in relation to my article. I'm also completely astonished, given the way Amir and Francine reacted. Not you. I thought, well, I signed my death warrant in Russian and Soviet circles. I never get invited to groupings like this one. So I'm again, very appreciative and very surprised. I reread the article and the response yesterday morning for the first time in more than 10 years. It came out in 2002, so I must have written it around 2000. And in rereading it, I was sorry that I wrote those couple of pages on the Nazi-Soviet comparison, because that's a red flag. That people that do take off on, and even if you try, as I tried to write it in a measured way, sometimes people don't hear that. But I was writing in a very specific context. It was right after the publication of Courtois' Livre Noir, the Black Book of Communism. Certainly in German circles, this was debated and debated and debated ever since the fall of the Berlin Wall. People were talking about linking the GDR and Nazi Germany, which I thought was totally specious, and I still am in these academic circles, which were trying to provide a far more nuanced history of the German Democratic Republic. So there were, in a sense, I couldn't avoid dealing with that. I was also in the process of writing a book on genocide in the 20th century, and I was trying to work through, what I thought about the Nazi-Soviet comparison. But it did, I think you're right, I think having put that in that article, even though I think there's probably no way to avoid it, it did certainly get people very aroused.
What was interesting about it is that you're coming from the German field also. What were we supposed to do? Right? But there's another dimension to it, which was, so many of us. It has to do with domestic American politics, European politics, the works. We're invested in a certain, why is it that we all support the Soviet Union but not Nazi Germany, for example? How did we make that particular choice, right? We're still invested in this. So when you said, there's a comparison to be made here, it was tapping into that whole genealogy of politics, family politics, and all these things. And I think every family went through that. And so the response that you got was, well, Nazi Germany is not the Soviet Union, because that's what they were addressing, which is true.
Yeah.
But that's not the end of the conversation, as we're finding out.
I'll just add to the accolades. It was reading that forum that gave me the idea that this conversation shouldn't have ended in 2002. And then going on to read the work that Marina and Vera and others have been doing. So So they're well deserved.
If you ever feel lonely in the German field, just
I can tell you for sure, I wouldn't get these kind of responses in the German.
If I may do some justice to our field, I think that in what can be called Russian imperial history, you have a really intensive and very serious debate about, and I think that most of those who specialize in imperial history agree with me, debate about precisely the categories that we are using. And the politics of comparison in Russian imperial history is something that is really very, very important. And when Yanni mentioned, this Hoover kind of method of doing research, right, so I think that this is very unfair categorization because maybe because we are latecomers, maybe because this field of this reconsideration of Russia as an imperial space came relatively late, and we were borrowing, we were translating themselves the way these people who used race were very well aware about them being these interpreters and translators. We discuss our categories in different venues and in many works, and I can refer, of course, to Jane. I can refer to thousands of articles in Ab Imperium, and precisely on race, we had a very interesting debate with participation of German, specialists of German race science about the so-called liberal race, and whether you can work with this concept of liberal race and transform this German, this kind of paradigm developed for Germany onto Russia and Central Europe. And there was this book published in Russian with 2 articles by Vera and Karl, precisely on definitions and categories. So I think that imperial history is very self-reflective in terms of categories and how we use race. And this is not about just re-establishing race or normalizing Russian history by any means. This is precisely about asking these questions of why Russians were immune or were not immune, or in some periods, some groups were actually embracing very actively this particular language of explaining groupness and debating groupness. And so I think that this workshop in a way represents this very self-conscious work on the part of Russian imperial historians and students of Soviet history to engage with other histories on a conceptual level. So not just as vacuum cleaners, but rather as...
I actually like vacuum cleaners.
Yeah.
Jane? Yeah.
So just picking up on what Marina had to say. I think that there has been an ongoing examination of empire that started in the late Soviet period. And it goes back to this question about what questions do we ask and why, and which we. So we in the American academic community, I'm just speaking for some of us, right? Or maybe the Western one, but there were certain questions that simply weren't asked in the Soviet Union. And partly because of the politicized environment that is in that people who would find it politically incorrect to pose questions about racism in the Soviet times. And you see a shift after 89-91, which I think is really profound, not just in sources, but in the ability of people to pose different questions, liberated from a kind of bifurcated, internally to the West bifurcated academic community that just didn't permit certain kinds of questions. And one of the questions that really got opened was that of empire, and empire in the Imperial Russia, empire, Soviet Union as an empire, and a revival of some old scholarship, which was fantastically interesting, but everybody had been ignored. But with 89, essentially, began to really be on the table again. So I just want to make a comment about I'm looking back at the content of the conversations that we've had over the last 2 days. And I have one question I really would like to have people answer, and then I make a comment about what I've heard. But the one question I have is that at the very beginning of the conference, with Carl and Vera's papers, and it's two, I think, in some ways, well, the first 2 panels, I would say, we moved toward this question, we had this question of whether in the late 19th and early 20th century, there was a different kind of use of a different kind of racial category. So we moved away a little bit from the narodnost, and ethnicity, and whether they're the same things as race and so on, and the race science that Maria discussed, to these groupings that then reappeared in the last panel of the yellow race, the, however you do it, the Mongol race, the Turkic, Ham-Turkic, and so on. And I'm still would like to know from the people who really work in this field whether there is a kind of a tendency to, in this late imperial period, to come up with these transnational or trans-imperial categories that are racialized, and that's quite different from the kind of questions that we were asking about, let's say, the pre-1860 period. So that's the question that I have in my mind. But the comment I have is that one of the things we kept hearing, it seems to me, is the capacity of political actors, leaders, governments, and intellectuals to carry multiple registers of categorical difference. That we don't really have to worry about, is it ethnicity or is it race? We can hear these multiple languages being used instrumentally or by academics or by creative people with no problem with their overlaps, their possible contradictions. And I'd like to just propose that then when we thought about the category of race itself, as Marina's book shows spectacularly, it too contains multiple registers, multiple capacities. It's in this sense, an enriching vocabulary. You can use it in so many different ways. So the one comment, and then to make things more complicated, we tried to look at things over time, and we see that within, say, the world of Russian academic, political, social discourse, these multiple registers can be changed, transformed, and transmuted, reappear, recuperated over the 2 centuries that we've looked at. So I just want to call attention to the capacity for maintaining, sustaining multiple discourses at the same time as a empowerment, I think, of Russian governors. Both the imperial, I would say, straight through to the present. Tonight we don't have racism, but and this capacity to sustain them at the same time, and just to question, what this means. In other words, it's only academics who really want to get rid of contradictions. But most people like, they live with them all the time, but there are maybe only some political regimes which actually are great at exploiting the capacity of sustained contradiction, as a tool of power. So my last point is simply that I'm excited by these projects that Elena's and Annika's of looking at the sort of popular uses of these various discourses where people have the capacity to pick up on one or the other and use it. But that makes the position of elites all the more responsible. It is elites, both academics and political leaders, who are extremely responsible for a vocabulary that can be manipulated, used, reinterpreted, and so on. So I'll just close on that issue. I think that this conference is bringing up a term that is manipulable and and the way we think about it, what we say about it, what we do with it, is extremely important. But we're coming out of a political intellectual tradition where multiple interpretations is the name of the game.
Eric?
I thought that was a very interesting comment, but I just want to comment on one little thing that you said at the beginning, which also came up in the last session. The term pan-Turkism, which basically does not exist.
Yes.
And I don't know if, you know, Russian officials and academics are looking at the Ottoman Empire and thinking about there's a pan-Turkism. I mean, this is another field I'm no expert, but I know something about, mostly because next month is the centenary of the Armenian genocide. Pan-Turkism, to the extent that it emerges at all, is not an Islamic ideology, it's a Young Turk ideology. And even there, you know, it's actually a minor stream in a rapidly evolving, highly mobile ideological and political practice of the Young Turks between 1908 and 1918, basically. But you know, there are some, you know, ideas about creating this pan-Turkish empire through the Caucasus, of course, back to Central Asia. But really, what the Young Turks are doing is trying to create, I would say a national empire, and trying to reconstitute the Ottoman Empire, but reconstitute it with its European domains. But it's really, from what I understand from, you know, real Ottoman and Turkish specialists, it's a very, very minor strain. So I don't know why Russianists are talking
It
about
was because
is
pan-Turkism
my question.
was a yellow peril of a sort. It
Yes.
was recognized by the imperial government as a
Okay.
very, very real threat,
Right.
and they really believed in
They-
this.
They
Yes.
were, you know,
They
and
believed in it at the time.
guys in the Caucasus and all that. But
But
that's
pan-Islamism was also
variant.
invented in many ways by the imperial government as a threat.
It was also during the Russian Civil War, there's a slight breakup, and a lot of the sort of Turkic-speaking leaders were in touch with some of the Republican leaders, and it was
Yeah, and that's all.
Yeah, we can,
I did want to mention one thing. Jane, I mean, nicely brought it all together. I should mention that she's been instrumental in all sorts of things that happen at NYU and in the profession. I mean, how many people in the room actually have been, you know, helped, encouraged by Jane and her own work on empires. I think is so capacious that this is one of the ways that we're able to talk about race today. And so a lot of this is a tribute to your work. Thank you. As for David, oh, by the way, so the Jordan Center doesn't claim credit for this, but in fact, we're David's work. So, yeah, so enjoy your moment, right?
why didn't you leave me here by myself?
So, I'm sorry. I think you did a wonderful job in bringing together mixing the disciplines and mixing the fields so well. And I think it's a wonderful start for this. And I wish you good luck with the volume. Right? Thanks again. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us.